One of the important main characters in Philip K. Dick's novel, The Man in the High Castle, is this person, Rudolph Wegner, who is an agent, an operative of the Naval Counter-Intelligence, the Abwehr, which is a part of the German Reich, but actually one that has been very sidelined, as we'll talk about in just a moment. And he is on an incredibly important mission, and he's traveling, as he often does, in disguise. He will reveal himself eventually as Rudolph Wegner, but at first he's traveling as Victor Baynes, a Swedish national who is keen to engage with the Pacific states of America, having to do with plastic moldings and processes. He's a businessman, right? And then later on, when he's traveling back to the Reich, he is going to claim to be Conrad Goltz, again, another businessman. And so it's interesting to see the shapes that this takes. There's perhaps more freedom and less scrutiny as being involved in the economic world of business. But actually, he is an operative of the Abwehr. And as he is going to remark a little bit later on when they are talking about Operation Dandelion, the Abwehr has been sidelined for decades. Other organizations, other apparatus within the Nazi regime have been trying to get rid of them for years. And in a certain way, this makes it possible for the Abwehr to be free of the other influences that would otherwise be, corrupting them. And they're not completely the good guys, but they're certainly better than the other Nazi state parts. And one of the things that we see that is really, I think, revealing of Wegner's character is his engagements with and about his fellow countrymen who are, in fact, Nazis. And the first one takes place as he's riding this rocket that goes from Germany to the Pacific states of America fairly quickly. And he's sitting next to this younger man with close-cropped hair who begins talking to him in German. And Baynes says, "I'm sorry, I don't speak German." And they're quite amazed about that. Clearly, the young German could not believe that anyone in the modern world, anyone who had international business dealings and rode, who could afford to ride on the latest Lufthansa rocket, could or would not speak German. And so he asks him, "Well, what line are you in?" And Baynes says, "Plastics, polyesters, resin, ersatz, industrial uses. No consumers, commodities." And he suggests that he can mail him a catalog. And then they get into a discussion about art, because it turns out Alex Lotze is, in fact, an artist. He's having his work exhibited to try to help, cultural exchange. And Baynes says, "I don't care for modern art. I like the old pre-war cubists and abstractionists. I like a picture to mean something, not merely to represent the ideal." And then Lotze says, "That's the work of art, to advance the spirituality of man over the sensual. Your abstract art represented a period of spiritual decadence, of spiritual chaos, due to the disintegration of society, the old plutocracy, the Jewish and capitalist millionaires, the international set that supported the decadent art. Those times are over. Art has to go on. It can't stay still." And Baynes will be thinking to himself, yeah, okay, this is sort of a typical Nazi guy. And they get into a discussion as they're flying down about the baseball stadium. And the Nazi, Lotze, is, laughing about this and how the Japanese waste their time on that. And then Lotze says, "It looks," about the baseball stadium, "as if it was designed by a Jew." Then we have this very interesting description. Baynes regarded the man for a time. He felt strongly for a moment the unbalanced quality, the psychotic streak in the German mind. Did Lotze actually mean what he said? Was it a truly spontaneous remark? And so let's pause on that for a moment. What is he actually talking about? So, this attribution of Jewishness to anything that is unseemly, foreign, scary, silly, whatever is non-German. And is this something that Lotze just sort of throws out there because he doesn't even have to think about it anymore? It's become a knee-jerk habit. Or is this something deliberate? And here's where Baynes, that is Wagner, decides to do something quite interesting. And he's provoked by some of his reflections, which we'll talk about elsewhere in terms of insanity and the Nazis. So he says, Mr. Lotze, I have never told anyone this. I am a Jew. Do you understand? You would not have known because I do not in any physical way appear Jewish. I have had my nose altered, my large greasy pores made smaller, my skin chemically lightened, the shape of my skull changed. In short, physically I cannot be detected. I can and have often walked in the highest circles of Nazi society. No one will ever discover me. And there are others of us. Do you hear? We did not die. We still exist. We live on unseen. After a moment, Lotze stuttered, the security police. The SD can go over my record. Baynes said, you can report me, but I have very high connections. Some of them are Aryan, some are other Jews in top positions in Berlin. Your report will be discounted, and then presently I will report you. And through these same connections, you will find yourself in protective custody. And then he is near Lotze again. In fact, Baynes said, I do not like your looks, Mr. Lotze, so I think I will report you anyhow. What is he doing? He's messing with him. He's getting a little bit of revenge. He's zinging him. He's putting a seed into his mind that can't be disconfirmed. He's playing to the Nazis' own paranoia. In chapter 5, it's not Nazis that are being encountered, but there's an interesting discussion that is going on between Tagomi and Baynes. And they're talking about older people and what the attitude is, in part because the story, the contact story, is this old businessman is coming in and they're supposed to arrange a situation. And so he says, this is Tagomi, he says, we have not in our society solved the problem of the aged, more of which persons occur constantly as medical measures improve. China teaches us rightly to honor the old. However, the Germans cause our neglect to seem close to outright virtue. I understand they murder the old. And he says, being from Scandinavia, you no doubt have had much contact with the Festung Europa. Can one take an attitude like this? You are a neutral, being Swedish, right? Give me your opinion, if you will. And Baynes says, I don't understand what attitude you mean. And Tagomi says, towards the old, the sick, the feeble, the insane, the useless, and all variations. Of what use is a newborn baby, some Anglo-Saxon philosopher reputedly asked. I have committed that utterance to memory and contemplated it many times. Sir, there is no use in general. And then Tagomi says, isn't it true that no man should be the instrument for another's needs? Please give me your neutral Scandinavian opinion. And then they go forward talking about the Jews again and the Japanese attitude towards the Jews. And then finally we get sort of a reprise of this when Wegner is returning home. And this is after all the power struggles are taking place. He's not sure if he's going to be arrested or killed or what's going to happen. And he goes on, and as he finds out that he's going to be taken by the SD and the Heydrich people, he says, what does it matter? Even if Dr. Goebbels is deposed and Operation Dandelion is canceled, they will still exist. The black shirts, the Partei, the schemes, if not in the Orient, then somewhere else, on Mars and Venus. And he says, this is the terrible dilemma of our lives. Whatever happens, it is evil beyond compare. Why struggle then? Why choose if all alternatives are the same? Evidently, we go on from day to day. We cannot do it all at once. It is a sequence, an unfolding process. We can only hope and try. We don't live in an ideal world where morality is easy, where one can do right with no effort because we can detect the obvious. And then he, questions the guards and they reveal again this mindset that the Nazi regime not only has, but tends to promote in its people. Now, this leads naturally to talking about the efforts to try to capture this operative and eventually to take him out. So we find that there's two important Nazi leaders in the Pacific states of America. We have the Freiherr Hugo Reis, the Reich's counsel in San Francisco, and then we also get Kreutz von Mehra, the chief of the SD, the Sicherdienstheit in the Pacific States of America area, and they've got some conflicted relationships, and they're having a conversation about that Abwehr character, meaning Wegner. And so Rice is trying to figure out what he's talking about. He says, to my knowledge, there's 3 or 4 Abwehr characters on the Pacific coast at the moment. And Kreutz von Mehra says, I'm talking about the one who came in by Lufthansa within the last week. And what's he doing? Nobody knows. And he says, I'd like you to call the Foreign Office and have them call the Chancery, so this is the high up, and have whoever's on hand get hold of the Admiralty and demand the Abwehr either take its people back out of here or give us an account of why they're here. And he says, well, can't you do that, the SD? And he says, everything's in confusion. And then Rice thinks they've completely lost this Abwehr man. They, the local SD, were told on someone by Heydrich's staff to watch him. They missed a connection, and they want me to bail them out. And we find out some things about him from Kreutz von Mehra, that he's an aristocratic-looking fellow, about 40, a captain. Actual name, Rudolph Wegner. One of those old monarchist families from East Prussia, probably supported von Papen in the System Zeit. And he says, the only answer I see it to these monarchist hangers-on is to cut the budget of the Navy so that they can't afford, and then they basically are going to end the conversation. So what we've got here are 2 different Nazi operatives, one of whom doesn't really care that much about this, but is actually considered to be quite competent by the Abwehr operative, as we find out. The other is in charge of the local police and is kind of a screw-up as well. And they're telling us stuff about this Abwehr fellow, namely that he's from an older mindset, one that's a bit more humane, one that stresses duty and honor and things like that, which are hard to come by in the Reich. Then in chapter 11, this is taken up again, and we find that Rice is going to his office, and Kreutz von Mehra is already there. And he says, listen, Freiherr, we located this Abwehr fellow, this Rudolph Wegner. He showed up at an old Abwehr drop we have under surveillance, and we trailed him back to his hotel. And Rice is like, oh, that's fine. And Kreutz von Mehra says, this is important. I notified Kaltenbrunner about it, top priority. You'll probably getting word from Berlin anytime now. And what ends up happening is they realize that there's a phone call this morning about an appointment at 10:20 in the Japanese person's office. We're trying to trace the call. And he says, we may pick up this fellow. If we do, we'll naturally send him back to the Reich. However, the Japs or Sacramento may protest and try to block it. They'll protest to you, and they'll run a truckload of those Tokoya Toughs to the airport. And he's already on the way to the appointment. And Kreutz von Mehra says, I have a commando squad ready, 5 good men. They look like violinists, nice ascetic faces, soulful, maybe like divinity students. They'll get in. The Japs will think they're a string quartet. They'll walk right up to the door. They're dressed just right in plain sight, broad daylight, up to this Wegner, gather around him, appear to be conferring. No violence, just, Herr Wegner, come with us, please, you understand? And between the vertebrae of his spine, a little shaft, pump, upper ganglia, paralyzed. So they're talking about all of this, and then a phone call comes in from Berlin. And Rice is told, this is Dr. Goebbels, the chancellor, right? And he says, General Heydrich has just asked me to call you. There is an agent of the Abwehr there in San Francisco. His name is Rudolph Wegner. You are to cooperate fully with the police regarding him. There isn't time to give you details. Simply put your office at their disposal. So that is the setup for the attack by the SD operatives to try to get Wagner, but also to disrupt this meeting that's taking place. And that leads us to Wagner's mission. So he's supposed to make contact with this aged businessman, Yatabe, who is actually General Tedeki, who is officially retired but still plays a very important role within the Imperial Japanese government. And there's this scene where they both reveal themselves and their identities to each other. They're at the Nippon Times building so that they've got a cover for this, and that is what has been organized. So there's a lot of waiting. You know, we had this reference earlier to the Abwehr drop. Wegner is going to call every single day and not get a hold of the general, of course, because he hasn't come in yet, and he's getting impatient, and he's getting worried. So here's from chapter 10. It had been a terrible 2 weeks for Mr. Baynes. From his hotel room, he had called the trade mission every day at noon to ask if the old gentleman had put in an appearance. The answer had been an unvarying no. Mr. Tagomi's voice had become colder and more formal each day as Mr. Baynes prepared to make his 16th call. He thought, sooner or later they'll tell me Mr. Tagomi is out. What has happened? Where is Mr. Yatabe? He had a fairly good idea. The death of Martin Bormann, the party chancellor, which is shaking up everything, had caused immediate consternation in Tokyo. Mr. Yatabe, no doubt, had been en route to San Francisco a day or so offshore when new instructions had reached him. Returned to the home islands for further consultation. And now he has to figure out, what am I going to do? So this is more of his internal mental discourse. It had been made very clear to him by his superiors he was not to contact the Abwehr under any circumstances. He was simply to wait until he'd managed to make connections with a Japanese military representative. He was to confer with the Japanese, and then he was to return to Berlin, but no one had foreseen that Bormann would die at this particular moment. Therefore, the orders had to be superseded by more practical advice. His own, in this case, since there was no one else to consult. In the PSA, at least 10 Abwehr persons were at work, but some of them, and possibly all, were known to the local SD and its senior regional chief, Bruno Kreutz von Mera. So he's going to go and make contact with some of the Japanese people and the SD people, as we see in the rest of chapter 10. And then we get this culmination in chapter 12, the revelation of Operation Dandelion. And this provokes a discussion between the two principals, General Tedeki and Rudolph Wegner, neither of whom claim to represent their governments, but both of whom are involved. And the urgency here is that this is going to be a massive nuclear attack preceded by a false flag operation, and the Goebbels government, since he takes power, are in favor of carrying out this attack. So this requires, as Wagner says, that the Japanese government should enter into Reich's affairs and support what they view as the most malignant part of the Nazi regime, Heydrich and the SD and SS, right? So that's quite important in the understanding what Wagner is up to here. Then there's an attack that's made by the SD people. We saw that Bruno Kreutz von Mera has organized a squad of commandos, and they try to assassinate Wagner. And interestingly, Tagomi saves him with his World War II, or actually Civil War pistol, shooting them with his Colt 44. And there's this very interesting scene as well that's going on. So Tagomi decides to consult the I Ching, the oracle, to try to make sense of what happened. Mr. Baynes, seeing Mr. Tagomi distractedly manipulating the handful of vegetable stalks, recognized how deep the man's distress was. For him, Mr. Baynes thought, this event, his having to kill and mutilate these two men, is not only dreadful, it is inexplicable. What can I say that might console him? He fired on my behalf. The moral responsibility for these two lives is therefore mine, and I accept it. I view it this way. And then Tedeki comes over and says, you witnessed the man's despair. He, you see, was no doubt raised as a Buddhist, even if not formally. The influence was there, a culture in which no life is to be taken, all lives holy. And he says, the book will help him. It provides an external frame of reference. And then Baynes thinks to himself, another frame of reference which might help him would be the doctrine of original sin. I wonder if he's ever heard of it. We are all doomed to commit acts of cruelty or violence or evil. That is our destiny due to ancient factors, our karma. To save one life, Mr. Tagomi had to take two. The logical, balanced mind cannot make sense of that. A kindly man like Mr. Tagomi could be driven insane by the implications of such reality. Nevertheless, Mr. Baynes thought, the crucial point lies not in the present, not either in my death or the death of the two SD men. It lies, hypothetically, in the future. What has happened here is justified or not justified by what happens later. Can we perhaps save the lives of millions, all Japan, in fact? And he says, General Tedeki was right. Time would give Mr. Tagomi perspective. Either that, or he would perhaps retreat into the shadows of mental illness, avert his gaze forever due to a hopeless perplexity. And we are not really different from him, Mr. Baynes thought. We are faced with the same confusions. Therefore, unfortunately, we can give Mr. Tagomi no help. So this is a person who's really thinking profoundly about ethical, moral quandaries and not coming to easy solutions, right? We see this coming out again as he returns to the Reich in chapter 15, once again in disguise, under the cover name Conrad Goltz, a dealer in medical supplies on a wholesale basis, and he thinks, I wonder what I accomplished. It's up to General Tedeki now, whatever he can do in the home islands. But at least we got the information to them. We did what we could. He thought, but there's no reason to be optimistic. Probably the Japanese can do nothing to change the course of German internal politics. And he's thinking about the Nazis and the insanity that seems to be rooted in this ideology and in the peoples involved. And then he gets essentially detained or arrested by these Waffen-SS men who take him and say that Heydrich is in the OKW, the command of the Leibstandarte division, and that they're not going to allow him to be approached by Wehrmacht or party persons. And he thinks, well, I'm not going to be shot at least, but what else is going to happen? And, can I actually reach Abwehr people in protection? It doesn't look that way. So we don't actually know what happens ultimately to Wagner, but we know that he's alive at the end of the book, and he's succeeded in his mission. And we see all these very interesting reflections of the kind of person he is coming through the things that he says and does and thinks.